Welcome. I'm Inspector Purbright, and tonight I invite you into a new mystery.
A young boy walks into a flower show, kneels before a prize-winning cabbage, and leaves behind a pocket watch, a pair of gloves, and a rusted nameplate. No one knows who he is. No one understands what he's mourning. But Inspector Purbright asks the question no one else dares. What is a child trying to bury when the grave's already full? Before we begin, where in the world are you listening from tonight? A small town like Flaxborough, perhaps. Somewhere quiet, where secrets don't shout, but whisper. Let's begin. The Flaxborough Flower and Vegetable Show, while never riotous, generally concluded with a mild buzz of congratulatory hums, tepid tea, and the faint tang of varnish from the trestle tables. By the time the last chrysanthemum had drooped, the high street resumed its usual tempo of gossip and tea-cake digestion. It was not a venue one expected to provoke consternation, except perhaps over a mislabeled marrow. Yet it was here, among the neat ranks of beetroot and jam jars, that a small drama unfolded beneath the canvas of the Cabbage tent, the kind that Flaxborough, in its discreet and ecclesiastically repressed manner, would later refer to only with pursed lips and lingering glances. It began innocently enough. A boy, pale, quiet, no older than 10, had wandered in alone. Not unusual. Flower shows attracted children like blackberries attracted wasps, reluctantly tolerated but largely harmless. This boy, however, had done something both unchildlike and oddly ceremonial. He'd approached the grandest cabbage, a monstrous, crinkled orb raised by the redoubtable Mrs. Vining of Lime Crescent, and knelt before it. Not just a crouch or a slouch, but a full, solemn kneel. Then, from his coat pocket, he'd drawn a small bundle wrapped in newspaper and placed it reverently at the cabbage's base. It might have gone unnoticed if Mr. Partridge, Flaxborough's most devoted marrow polisher and part-time insurance underwriter, hadn't been adjusting the lighting on his purple runner beans nearby. He noticed the boy, the package, and something else, the child mouthing words silently. A prayer, an incantation, a complaint about Cabbage. Mr. Partridge, already predisposed to view children as either incipient vandals or existential warnings, crept over. By the time he reached the bundle, the boy had gone. The newspaper parcel was oddly damp. Inside was a pair of gardening gloves, a silver pocket watch, and a small wooden nameplate, once brass-plated, with the words, Edgar A. Mason, groundskeeper. It was the kind of item found on a bench, or a freshly filled grave. Mr. Partridge's hands trembled with something dangerously close to anticipation. Within the hour, he had informed Mrs. Vining, 2 members of the show committee, and eventually Sergeant Love of the Flaxborough Constabulary, who arrived in full expectation of a minor dispute over vegetable sabotage. Sergeant Love, ruddy, obliging, and ever hopeful that trouble might turn out to be someone else's. Gingerly turned over the gloves with a pencil. Strange, he said, but not necessarily sinister. Not sinister, Mrs. Vining retorted. A child leaves a mourner's offering to a cabbage, including what is very clearly a memorial plaque, and you find it strange. Could be a prank, said Love. Could be a misunderstanding. Children are awfully theatrical these days. But then came the question, who was Edgar A. Mason? A few inquiries at the town hall revealed the name belonged to a man who had indeed been the groundskeeper at the Flaxborough Cemetery, retired some 8 years ago, and, it turned out, buried there himself a month prior. The council clerk, Mr. Bleat, remembered the death as unremarkable, but remarked with faint relish that Mr. Mason had once submitted a strongly worded letter about improper daffodil planting on consecrated ground. He didn't like to be contradicted, Bleat added, even by Flora. By sunset, the story had grown limbs. According to Mrs. Routledge of the Women's Guild, the boy was the grandson. According to Mrs. Routledge's rival, Mrs. Spinks, he was no relation at all, but merely touched in the head and kept in a spare room by his aunt. Both agreed that the placing of the watch and gloves was at best an ill omen, and at worst an indictment of council handling of the dead. When the chief constable, a man deeply allergic to unusual paperwork, caught wind of the incident, he suggested, with a firmness born of professional fatigue, that perhaps Inspector Purbright ought to take a quick look. Which is how, the next morning, Purbright found himself in the Cabbage tent, hands behind back, eyes on the empty patch where the boy had knelt. He said nothing for a long while. Then he turned to Sergeant Love and said, very mildly, "We should begin by finding out who that boy is, and then we should find out what he thinks he's done." Love, who had rather hoped they would forget the boy entirely and go back to onion rosettes, sighed. "Will we be treating this as a crime, sir?" Purbright gave him a courteous smile. "I wouldn't dare say yet, but it does appear to have involved a funeral, a vegetable, and a message of sorts. That seems enough to be getting on with, doesn't it?" And with that, Flaxborough found itself, again, on the quiet cusp of something peculiar. Purbright arrived at the cemetery just after 9, walking rather than driving, which gave him time to consider the orderliness of things. Flaxborough, for all its gossip and modest eccentricities, maintained a certain respect for the arrangement of death. Clean gravel paths, well-behaved hedges, headstones polished at regular intervals. Even the dead were expected to keep up appearances. The cemetery gates were ajar. A tabby cat slipped through ahead of him and vanished behind a row of ornamental yews. It was quiet, except for the soft slap of leaves in a faint breeze and the distant clatter of milk bottles being collected. The air had that particular weight of damp stone and mown grass, the kind that settled on a man's coat sleeves whether he stood still or not. He found the grave easily. Edgar A. Mason, groundskeeper, read the headstone in crisp-cut granite. Below, a man who knew every root and weed. The sentiment was perhaps more botanical than heartfelt. There were traces of the previous incident, a faint rectangle in the soil where the newspaper parcel had rested. Someone had disturbed the earth again, not violently, but recently. Purbright crouched and examined a shallow furrow where a shoe had pressed down and twisted slightly, as if the foot had hesitated. A child's shoe, he thought, narrow with a worn heel. Behind him, gravel crunched and Sergeant Love's familiar shape hove into view, his cap already askew despite the morning's brevity. "Not much to look at," Love said, nodding toward the grave. "Not much is after burial," said Purbright, standing slowly. "But there's been someone back here, I think. Not the boy, another adult after the fact." Love made a small, non-committal noise. "We've asked around. No one's seen the child since the flower show. Local schools are keeping an eye out." "Nothing so far." "And the nameplate?" "Still at the station. No fingerprints, or at least nothing usable. Someone tried to polish it recently. Odd thing to tidy, isn't it?" Purbright nodded. "People polish things when they want to remember, or when they wish to be remembered as having remembered." He turned from the grave and looked up at the row of houses beyond the cemetery hedge. Drab semi-detacheds from the 30s, brickwork like liver, curtains all drawn at uniform heights. He studied them in silence for a moment. "You said Mason retired 8 years ago?" "Yes, sir. Lived just off Dandelion Lane, according to personnel records. Alone. No wife or listed family. But someone buried him." Love hesitated. "The council, technically. A pauper's arrangement. No one claimed the body for 3 days. The undertaker said there was a note, just a note, giving instructions." Purbright's brow furrowed delicately. "A note?" "In an envelope, no signature. Said to bury him here, under this exact tree, the one he planted, apparently. Some poetic nod to roots and so on." "Was the envelope kept?" Love's face twitched. "I'm afraid not." "Thrown away, sir. The undertaker said it was just ordinary paper, no return address. Nothing to trace." Purbright sighed, but without irritation. He looked again at the grave. "Did Mason have any odd habits?" he asked. Love blinked. "Sir, did he believe in messages from beyond? Spiritualism, that sort of thing?" No mention in his file. But there was a letter to the council once, bit cranky, about how the cemetery paths were all wrong, disrupting the Earth's alignment. Council ignored him, naturally, of course. Purbright paused. "Still, this boy, he brought a watch, gloves, and a nameplate. Tokens. Personal ones. Too personal for a stranger. Or too theatrical for a grandson." Purbright gave a faint smile. "Yes, there's that." The rest of the morning involved tea of unsatisfying strength and an interview with Mr. Emlyn Sprod, the undertaker, who remembered Mason primarily for his enjoyment of straight lines. Sprod's establishment, situated between a solicitor's office and a knitting supply shop, had the air of long damp, like someone had sealed it in steam sometime in 1910. Sprod, who wore a tie the color of tongue and had a voice like folding linen, recalled the burial clearly. "No mourners," he said, polishing a shelf that didn't seem to require it. "Very tidy chap, Mr. Mason. Labeled his socks. Sent me instructions in the post. I suppose he didn't like to rely on people. Do you still have the instructions?" "Number, I'm sorry. We don't keep files on the unclaimed. It's rather morbid." "Indeed," said Purbright, not bothering to point out the irony. On the way back to the station, he passed St. Etheldreda's. A line of pensioners was just beginning to queue for the parish lunch, lamb stew with Protestant gravitas. One of them, a woman with a handbag of architectural dimensions, peered at him curiously and then whispered behind her glove to her neighbor. He nodded to them politely and continued. Gossip, he thought, would now be galloping ahead of fact. At the station, a surprise awaited in the form of Miss Teatime, Flaxborough's occasional clairvoyant and full-time buyer of Battenberg cake. She stood in the lobby wearing a cape that suggested unsanctioned theatrics and a hat shaped like an aubergine. "Inspector Purbright," she said, with grave satisfaction, "I've come because I dreamed of a cabbage. A weeping cabbage, and it spoke in tongues." Purbright folded his hand behind his back. "Miss Teatime," he said evenly, "how very nutritional." She leaned forward. "The boy is not from here. He does not go to school here. He came on purpose. That's what the dream said. The cabbage wasn't local." Purbright blinked. It may have been Welsh. "Don't mock the psychic realm, Inspector. You know I was right about the missing vicar's bicycle." He inclined his head slightly. "You did suggest it was underwater, which turned out to be technically correct, though I doubt even you foresaw it being hurled into the duck pond by Mrs. Tovey." Miss Teatime smiled primly. "Some truths must come via poultry." He waited patiently. Eventually, she produced a scrap of paper, a name scribbled in purple ink. "Gareth," she said. "That's the name I heard. Gareth Mason. I think he's the boy." Purbright took the paper without comment. It was not the most conventional lead, but then again, many things in Flaxborough began with something tea-stained and unbidden. He returned to his office and called up the council archives. There, tucked in an unremarkable baptism register from 1953, was a brief mention. Gareth L. Mason, son of Edgar A. Mason. No mother listed. Love, who had been peering through the door with the eagerness of a retriever denied a walk, stepped in at last. "Well?" he asked. Purbright tapped the register gently. "Mr. Mason, it seems, was not as solitary as he appeared. He had a son, which means we've got a missing boy, a no next of kin." Purbright nodded. "And a boy who doesn't go to school here, which begs the question. How did he get here, and why bury the memory of a man already in the ground?" Love frowned. Something unsettled him. Or someone told him to come. Purbright looked out the window. Rain had begun to tap against the glass, soft and regular as a funeral march. Find out if there's any record of a Gareth Mason born in the late 50s or early 60s. Start with the Midlands, and see if any boarding houses reported a child in the last few days. Quiet, alone. Love scribbled dutifully and made for the door. As it closed, Purbright remained seated, one hand resting on the desk, eyes on nothing in particular. There was grief somewhere in this, he felt, but not the ordinary kind. This had been arranged, with care, with purpose. As though the boy had been told a secret he could neither explain nor escape. And someone, somewhere, had ensured that he'd come to Flaxborough to bury it. The following morning, the Flaxborough Mercury ran a small article on page 7 under the headline, "Cabbage Ceremony Causes Stir at Local Show." It featured a single photograph, a slightly unfocused image of Mrs. Vining clutching a cup of tea and looking scandalized, and a short paragraph that made more of Mr. Partridge's opinion than of the event itself. The boy, naturally, was referred to as a young person of unclear intentions. Purbright, reading it at his desk with the corner of a dry toast flake clinging to his collar, permitted himself a brief smile. The town had officially moved from confusion to commentary. That meant tongues would loosen. It also meant that, within days, at least 3 separate residents would claim to have seen the boy beforehand, all in different locations and all described in contradicting detail. Sergeant Love entered with the faintly breathless energy of a man trying to hide that he'd just had 2 custard creams in the corridor. "No Gareth Mason in the Midlands born between 1958 and 1963, sir," he said. "Nothing official. There is one in Grimsby, but he's a chartered accountant with a squash injury, and I doubt he's recently laid tribute to a cabbage." Purbright gave a soft grunt of amusement. "Try broader parameters. Name, then birth range. People aren't always who their certificates say they are." Love hesitated. "Could be a pseudonym." "Could be," Purbright said mildly. "Or an old lie that someone's still honoring." Love shifted, uncertain. "Should we publish something? Ask for sightings?" "Not yet." Purbright reached for a small envelope that had arrived that morning. No return address. Inside was a single strip of photographic film, partially exposed. He held it up to the light and narrowed his eyes. "Let's let the town do what it does best, fret in private and speculate in public." The door opened again, admitting Miss Lucilla Teatime. Without her hat today, she appeared rather more formidable, as if she might be auditioning for a role in a melodrama about suffragettes and unlicensed spirits. "I have another dream," she announced. "Or rather, I had one." Purbright gestured gently toward the guest chair. "Do sit down. What spoke to you this time? A parsnip?" Miss Teatime sniffed. It was the boy this time. Standing under a tree, wearing a funeral coat 3 sizes too big. The sky was bleeding. "I dare say the sky does that quite often in Flaxborough." "What tree?" "The one by the grave." Purbright's fingers twitched slightly. "Did he say anything?" "He said, I promised I wouldn't speak." Then he looked at me like I'd betrayed him. Love blinked. "That's rather specific." "I didn't invent it, Sergeant," she said crisply. "My dreams have an inconvenient accuracy. Ask the bank manager's second wife." Purbright folded his hands. "Did the boy seem frightened?" Miss Teatime considered. "Number more?" "Restrained. As if he'd been told to be frightened, but hadn't quite decided whether it was worth the effort." When she had gone, with a tin of bourbons tucked neatly under one arm, courtesy of the front desk, Purbright turned again to the graveyard. This time, he was not alone. A thin woman in her mid-60s stood by Mason's headstone, holding a paper bag as though unsure whether to eat from it or leave it as tribute. Her hair was tightly pinned in a fashion that had not changed since the early 60s, and her coat bore the sort of buttons that no longer fastened anything, merely gave the impression of security. "Mrs. Enderby?" Purbright asked, judging from the cemetery register's log of recent visitors. She turned slowly, her face unreadable. "Yes?" "Inspector Purbright. May I ask, were you acquainted with Mr. Mason?" She nodded. "He cut my privet for years, knew more about worms than was strictly necessary, but never stole a tool." "Did he ever mention a son?" Her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Only once, years ago. Said the boy went where the soil was softest. I thought it was a euphemism for Australia." "Did he ever receive visitors?" "One," she said after a pause. "Tall man, slick hair, looked like someone who didn't like to touch doorbells. Came, twice that I saw. Spoke to Edgar in the garden. Afterwards, Edgar smoked a pipe with a look like someone had told him the garden centre had burned down. Would you recognize this man again?" Mrs. Enderby hesitated. "Number? Not unless he looked exactly like a cloud of expensive disapproval." Back at the station, Love had managed to coax something out of the film strip. It showed a boy, half-turned, near a train station. Not Flaxborough. The signage read, "Ribblecombe Halt," a line now largely unused, though occasionally reopened for rural flower festivals and unpredictable freight. Purbright leaned in. "Zoom that part." Love squinted. "There's a woman just behind him. See the handbag? Same style Miss Teatime carries. But not her. Different shoulders. Could be his mother," Purbright murmured. "Or a guardian. Perhaps even someone hired." He stood and reached for his coat. "Where are we going, sir?" "Ribblecombe Halt. But it's barely on the map." "All the better," Purbright said. "A quiet child, an unused station, a dead man no one missed. These things like to meet in silence." The journey to Ribblecombe took the better part of 2 hours, largely because the final leg involved a stretch of crumbling country road and a mild dispute with a milk lorry. The halt itself consisted of little more than a wooden platform and a sign still bearing flaking wartime paint. But someone had been there recently. The gravel showed bicycle tread. A lone chocolate wrapper, half buried, bore a date no older than last week. Purbright walked slowly along the platform, eyes not on the horizon but the shadows under the bench. A small corner of paper peeked out. He crouched, lifted it. A child's drawing, crayons, a tree, a grave, and a boy, in a black coat larger than his limbs. Purbright stared at it for a long moment. Then he turned. Someone brought him here. Perhaps someone from Flaxborough. Someone who knew the timetable or knew how to avoid it. "Or both," said Love. Purbright nodded. "Start checking guest house registries. Last 7 days. See if anyone signed in with a child, and ask about anyone who arrived and asked for local graveyards." Love hesitated. "That's rather a strange thing to ask." "And that," said Purbright, slipping the drawing into his coat pocket, "is exactly what makes it useful." The next lead came not from any formal inquiry, but from the quietly resentful proprietor of the Rosewood Guest House, a woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Clitheroe and appeared to regard paying customers as an interruption to her domestic routine. She wore a crocheted shawl and smelled faintly of bleach and bacon, not entirely in that order. Sergeant Love, who had dropped in under the pretext of checking local lodging compliance, was treated to a tepid tea and a lengthy monologue on the decline of standards in modern travellers, particularly those who requested toast after 9 a.m. "You know what it is, Sergeant?" she asked, without expecting an answer. "They want hotel behaviour at pensioner prices. I told one gentleman, well, not so much a gentleman as a wet umbrella in a tie, that if he wanted a mini-fridge, he'd best marry one." Love smiled with the strained patience of a man navigating the outer edges of an anecdote. "Did you, by chance, have anyone stay this week with a child? A boy, quiet, possibly around 10 years old. She sniffed. That's the one who left the room smelling of vinegar and left his socks under the pillow, booked in under Mrs. Palmer. I said, "That's not your name." And she just looked at me. Thin woman. Wore a brooch shaped like a spider, which I did not care for. Stayed one night. Had the boy with her, never let him speak. Did she say where she was going? She didn't say anything, paid in cash, left early, 6 o'clock in the morning, crept out like she'd stolen the bedsheets. Love wrote it all down, then called Purbright. "Spider brooch," said Purbright. "That's not a common accessory." Mrs. Clitheroe seemed personally offended by it. As she would. He replaced the receiver and walked to the window of his office, watching the postman's slow progress down the street. Spider-shaped jewelry. Cash payments. A boy dressed like he was mourning someone else's grief. It was too composed to be spontaneous. In the afternoon, he returned to the cemetery. The tree, a yew, ancient and stooped like an elderly footman, cast its shadow neatly across Edgar Mason's grave. Someone had left a biscuit tin beside the headstone, unlabeled. No card. Inside, folded sheets of children's drawings. Some were scribbles, loops of color and uncertain shapes. But one, carefully drawn in dark green and red, depicted a house with its windows shut and no door. Above it floated a single word in shaky capitals, "Quiet." Purbright folded the paper without comment and slipped it into his coat. A few rows away, someone was watching him, a man with watery eyes and a raincoat that hung like a tired sermon. Mr. Hardacre, the part-time cemetery caretaker and full-time self-appointed chronicler of those who never got proper mourners. "You're looking for the boy," Hardacre said. Purbright turned slowly. "Am I?" Hardacre gave a crooked smile. "You wouldn't be back here again if you weren't." Purbright nodded. "Did you see him?" Hardacre scratched his chin. "Saw someone smaller than usual. Came by twice last week, stood by the tree. Never said anything. Never cried. Just stood. Alone? Number with her, her. Woman in black. Face like someone trying not to admit she's cold. Did you speak to them?" "Wouldn't have mattered if I had. The boy wasn't speaking. Not to her. Not to anyone." Purbright tilted his head. "Did she seem angry?" "No," Hardacre said. "Sad, maybe, or something worse. Like she knew she had to do something and hoped it wouldn't work." Back at the station, Sergeant Love had managed to extract a partial signature from the Rosewoods ledger using a pencil and patience, the tail end of a capital P and a curving L. Nothing definitive. But a name began to form in Purbright's mind. Not a name, perhaps, but a pattern. "Where's that list," he asked Love, "of women who worked at the cemetery before 1965? Love, already rifling through files, held one up. Mostly widows from the look of it. Cleaners, florists, nothing unusual. Look for one who left suddenly. No forwarding address. Someone close enough to Edgar Mason to know his habits." Love scanned the list. "Here, L. Palmer, Laura Palmer, floral assistant. Left in 1964 after what was described as an incident of misunderstanding with the council." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "That smells like the committee trying not to say what actually happened. She'd be, what now, in her 60s? Perhaps. Or older, perhaps younger. The council never did master birth records for staff who worked part-time and paid in stamps." He stood. "Let's visit the archives. Council minutes, 1964. I want to know what misunderstanding meant." It took them the better part of the evening. Most of the entries concerned drainage contracts, lavatory budgets, and the rather spirited debate about whether the mayor's dog should be allowed to attend the Remembrance Day ceremony. He was not. But eventually, buried between notices of resignation and minutes of condolence, they found it. August 18th, 1964. Miss Laura Palmer relieved of floral responsibilities following misappropriation of mourning ribbons and unauthorized display of personal tributes on public graves. "That sounds like someone burying more than flowers," murmured Purbright. There was no mention of Mason in the entry, but the timing was suggestive. "Anything else?" Love asked. Purbright flipped 2 pages. "Here, a complaint filed by Edgar Mason. Said a female staff member had interfered with his flower arrangements and introduced personal effects to plots not her own. She was decorating graves or sending messages." They left the archives as the lamplighters, 2 boys on bicycles, wobbled past the market square, tossing their cigarette butts in the bins with choreographed accuracy. That night, Purbright sat at his desk past 11, listening to the distant clang of the railway line and the ticking of the police station's grandfather clock. He examined the drawings again, each one stranger than the last. In one, the boy stood next to a figure entirely scribbled out. In another, the tree had grown eyes. Then, finally, one image caught his breath. It was the bench at Ribblecombe Holt, and under it, drawn in pale, careful pencil, a tiny box. He turned to his telephone. "Love," he said, "get your torch. We're going for a walk." Ribblecombe Holt at night was not a place that welcomed visitors. Even the stars, on that particular evening, seemed to regard it from a distance. Pinpricks of indifference in a sky smudged with cloud. The wind had picked up slightly since dusk and now moved through the surrounding hedgerows with a sound like muttering. Dry leaves collected at the base of the old station sign, and somewhere far off, a fox yelped once and then went quiet. Purbright and Sergeant Love arrived just after midnight, their boots crunching softly on the broken gravel. Love carried a torch, but kept switching it off and on in nervous bursts, as though trying not to startle the darkness. "Unusual hour for archaeology," he muttered. Purbright gave no reply. He moved to the bench in the center of the disused platform, the same one depicted in the child's drawing, and crouched without hesitation. A small puff of dust rose as his knee touched the old planks. He reached beneath the bench slowly, deliberately. There it was. A box, tin. Pale blue once, now scuffed and graying at the corners, the sort that once held sweets or cufflinks or secrets too small for drawers. Purbright lifted it without ceremony and opened the lid. Inside, a photograph folded, a child's train ticket unused, and a length of dark green ribbon, creased but uncut, still bearing faint traces of printed lettering. Mourning ribbon. One of the ones Miss Laura Palmer had once placed where she shouldn't have. Purbright unfolded the photograph. A black and white portrait of a man and a boy. The man was Edgar Mason. The boy, younger than the one they had seen at the flower show but recognizable, was Gareth. They stood in front of a greenhouse, both holding spades. "Looks like a family snapshot," said Love. "More than that," said Purbright quietly. "A record. Proof of something that wasn't supposed to be." Love frowned. "You think someone's trying to reclaim him?" "Mason. Number, I think someone is trying to make sure he isn't forgotten. Not by the town, not by himself." He examined the ticket. It was from a station that hadn't been in operation for 10 years. He handed it to Love. "Where's Netherwick Junction?" Love blinked. "Closed down. Goods line. Used to pass through the outskirts before the council turned it into an allotment scheme." Purbright nodded slowly. It was the line Mason worked on before he became groundskeeper. Back at the station, in the thin hours before dawn, they laid out the evidence on Purbright's desk. The box, the ribbon, the photo, the drawings. Each item now formed part of a quiet conversation. Love leaned back in the chair opposite. Suppose Laura Palmer took the boy in, hid him, or raised him without ever telling anyone who his father was. She may have tried to preserve something, or hide it. But then something changed. A promise made, perhaps. To visit the grave. To say goodbye. Love picked up the photograph again. But why now? Purbright glanced toward the window. The first hint of morning, grey and colourless, was beginning to dilute the edges of the sky. Because something is ending, he said. The next day, Mrs. Vining paid a visit to the station, uninvited but wholly undeterred by the lack of a formal summons. She entered the lobby with the purposeful rustle of a woman accustomed to committees, and fixed Love with a stare that had once withered 3 vicars and a deputy mayor. "I should like to make a statement," she said. Love blinked. "Concerning?" She opened her handbag with an air of mild disgust, as though it had misbehaved. From within she produced a newspaper clipping. Not the Mercury's coverage, but a different one. A larger article from the Daily Beacon dated nearly 10 years prior. The headline read, "Cemetery Employee Disciplined Over Unauthorized Memorials." The article featured no names, but the details were familiar. The mysterious floral tributes, the private letters left at public graves, and, buried in the final paragraph, a quote from a senior groundskeeper lamenting the confusion between grief and vanity. "I thought it might interest you," she said, handing it to Love. "It's not that I approve of gossip, but I do believe in documentation." Love thanked her, vaguely, and she swept out again, trailing an aroma of lavender and decision. Purbright, upon reading the article, merely nodded. So the council silenced it before it became a scandal. Or before someone asked the wrong question, Love said, like who the letters were for. Later that day, a call came through from a Miss Marion Lowe, the retired head mistress of a now-defunct preparatory school on the eastern edge of the county. Her voice was faint and tremulous with age, but her tone held the unmistakable steadiness of someone used to calling attendance. "I believe you're looking for Gareth," she said. Purbright leaned forward slightly. "We are. I had him for 1 term, 1969, enrolled under the name Gareth Palmer. Quiet, tremendously gifted at drawings, wouldn't speak unless spoken to, but once he drew a map of the graveyard from memory. Every stone, every path. It unsettled the other children." "Did anyone visit him?" "Only his aunt. I assumed she was his aunt. Small black hair, sharp shoulders, seemed not to like questions." "Do you know what happened to him?" "He vanished," she said. "No transfer papers. No explanation. One day the room was full. The next it was missing a child." "Did you report it?" She gave a quiet sigh. "We asked, but the records were unclear. The term was nearly over. No one wanted to stir it." Purbright thanked her, then replaced the receiver with a soft click. "So she kept him hidden again," Love said. "Why bring him out now?" "Because something's changed," Purbright repeated. He looked again at the nameplate from the flower show. It had been polished, but the underside was pitted and stained, not from weather, but from time spent underground. Someone had dug it up. The implication was not lost on him. That night, just before closing, a visitor came to the station. A woman in a black coat. Her eyes were the same color as unlit coal, and her hands bore the faint smudge of ink or paint. "I believe you're looking for me," she said. Purbright rose from his chair slowly. "Miss Palmer?" he asked. She hesitated. "No," she said, "but I buried her." Then she placed a parcel on his desk, carefully wrapped in newspaper, tied with twine. "For him," she said. "He's gone now." Purbright didn't move. "Gone where?" She looked down at her hands. "Where the soil's softest," she said. Then she left. The parcel, when opened, revealed a child's coat, still smelling faintly of autumn, and a note written in the hand of someone who had practiced too long to write neatly. "I wanted him to see who he was. I hope that's not a crime." Purbright folded the note and said nothing for a long while. The parcel sat untouched on Purbright's desk for the rest of the evening, a quiet presence amid the station's usual clutter. Tea rings on blotter paper, a file on stolen milk bottles, and a half-solved crossword with the word recompense, circled twice but unanswered. The coat inside was small, a little too well kept to have belonged to a boy left to the wind. Someone had cared for it, brushed it, mended the loose seam under the sleeve with a thread not quite the same color. Sergeant Love returned from an unfruitful visit to the bus depot, cheeks flushed from cold and mild embarrassment. "No sightings, sir. Nobody fitting her description asked for a ticket. No Gareth either." Purbright nodded absently. He had been studying the handwriting on the note again. There was nothing striking about it, no elaborate loops or idiosyncratic capitals, except its restraint. Every letter was neat, measured. Not the writing of someone trying to hide, but someone trying not to weep. "I don't think she wanted to escape," Purbright murmured. "I think she wanted to be seen, just once, by someone who'd understand." Love peered at the coat. "Think he's really gone?" Purbright's fingers gently closed the box. "I think she let him go. That doesn't always mean the same thing." Love paused, then ventured. "You believe Gareth wasn't her son, do you?" "Number I believe he was Edgar Mason's, but not hers, not biologically. I believe she took him in, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of something else. Love, maybe. Or loyalty. She raised him in silence, hid him even. But the grave, that was her line. That's where she let him speak for the first time." The station clock chimed once, echoing through the still corridors like a solitary footstep. Outside, the street lamps flickered to life, reluctant amber stars amid a town already drawing its curtains. The next morning brought drizzle and a delivery of fresh unease. The cemetery caretaker, Mr. Hardacre, phoned in before breakfast. His voice carried the flat weight of someone forced to repeat a thing he'd rather not have seen. "There's been digging, Inspector." "Where?" "Behind the greenhouse, where the old compost bins used to be. Someone's opened up the ground. Not a lot, just a patch. But something's missing." Purbright arrived before the mud had settled. The graveyard was slick with damp, and the smell of churned earth carried an oddly sweet tang, as if the soil had been interrupted mid-dream. Hardacre pointed without speaking. Behind the greenhouse, in a sunken corner of the grounds where the council once tried and failed to grow memorial lilies, a shallow trench had been disturbed. A square of earth, 3 feet by 3, cleanly cut and removed, revealing a darker, compacted layer beneath. There was no coffin, no casket, just the faint impression of something that had once been nestled there. A box, perhaps, or something like it. "Who would have known to look here?" Love asked, squinting. Purbright's reply was soft. "Only someone who had put something here before." Love turned. "You think the woman dug it up?" "Number thinks she came to retrieve what had already been taken, and found it gone." That afternoon, an unassuming envelope arrived at the station. No stamp, no postmark, simply placed in the letterbox by an unseen hand. Inside was a photograph, newer this time. Color. It showed Gareth standing in front of the yew tree at Mason's grave, holding a small shovel and looking up at someone just outside the frame. His expression was unreadable, but not afraid. The corner of the photo was slightly damp, as if carried close to the body. No message, just the image. Purbright held it for a long time, then passed it silently to Love. "Someone wanted us to know," Love said. "Someone wanted us to understand." They sat with that thought until the light changed. Later that day, Purbright took a quiet walk down to Lime Crescent. It was a street built for pensioners and paraffin heaters, tidy, square, and entirely free of whimsy. Number 11 belonged to one Mrs. Gilda Butte, formerly of the cemetery committee and known connoisseur of sponge cake and local mischief. She answered the door in her apron, flour on her cheek, and suspicion in her eyes. "Inspector," she said, "I haven't mislabeled any begonias this week, if that's what you've come for." "Not today, Mrs. Butte. I was hoping to ask about Laura Palmer." The name chilled the air between them. Mrs. Butte stepped back. "Better come in, then." The parlour smelled of lemon polish and regret. Two doilies clung precariously to the armrests of an otherwise confident settee. She was quiet, Mrs. Butte said, sitting without ceremony. But not dull. No, not dull. She had a way of watching people, not cruel, just patient. "Did you know she took in the boy?" "I knew she took something from the graveyard," Mrs. Butte said. "I never asked what." "Edgar, he was different after she left. Stiffer, like someone had put him back on a shelf too high to reach." "She left because of the council incident?" She left because she was told to. Gently, of course. The way committees tell women to leave without ever saying so. Purbright tilted his head. "Do you know who the boy's mother was?" Mrs. Butte's hands stilled on her lap. "I know who she wasn't. That's all we ever dared say out loud." As Purbright made his way back through town, he passed the churchyard. The vicar, a broad-faced man with a habit of exhaling before speaking, was placing a notice for Harvest Sunday. Purbright stopped him with a question. "Did Laura Palmer ever come to you?" The vicar raised his eyebrows. "Not in the way most do. She didn't confess. She corrected." "Corrected?" "Sermons," he said with a small laugh. "She once left me a note in the hymnal. Said I'd quoted Corinthians backwards. She was right." "Did she ever ask to bury something?" The vicar considered. "Once. Years ago. Asked if she could place a box in the earth behind the church. Said it was private. I said no, of course. She didn't argue. Just said, 'Then I'll find soil that's softer.'" Purbright stood in silence for a moment. That night he wrote a letter. Not to the press. Not to the council. But to the address left by Marion Lowe, the old headmistress. He kept it brief. The boy was seen. He was remembered. He's safe now, in whatever way he was meant to be. He signed it simply, H. Purbright. Then, at last, he turned off his lamp. The following morning arrived with a frost that clung to the town's hedgerows like a cautious rumour. Flaxborough had slipped into that part of autumn where every footstep on pavement sounded faintly brittle and milk bottles steamed on doorsteps like disgruntled chimney pots. At the police station, Sergeant Love had unwrapped a sausage roll with reverence and was halfway through contemplating whether it qualified as breakfast or lunch when Purbright entered, hatless and unusually quiet. He stood for a moment, examining the coat rack as though expecting it to yield a clue, then stepped into his office and sat, not at his desk, but on the windowsill. Love, watching from the doorway, waited. "She never meant to vanish," Purbright said eventually. "She only wanted to remove herself." Love wiped his fingers. "The Palmer woman?" Purbright nodded. "Everything she did. The boxes, the photographs, even the ribbons. It wasn't to hide. Not in the way criminals do. It was to preserve something, a memory, a version of the truth too fragile to survive scrutiny." "You think she's still in town?" "I think," Purbright said, folding his hands, "she never really left it. It was not the sort of case that lent itself to warrants or arrests. There had been no violence, no theft. Not unless one counted the quiet stealing of time. And yet a boy had appeared and vanished. A grave had been visited like a shrine, and someone had unearthed more than a buried box. At mid-morning, a new development arrived in the form of a package. Plain brown paper, hand-delivered by the postmistress, who swore it had simply turned up on the counter, no sender in sight. It contained a diary. Small, leather-bound, its cover worn soft by time and handling. Inside, neat, unhurried handwriting, each entry dated precisely, but only spanning 1 year, 1964. Purbright opened it at random. March 3rd. Edgar said the child won't speak. I told him that's not so unusual. Neither do I most days. He turned a few pages forward. June 18th. The council thinks I'm making a spectacle. I told them it's not my fault if no one else remembers the forgotten graves. I don't want applause, I want quiet. Further still. August 10th. The boy asked me if Edgar was his real father. I told him real is not the same as good. I don't think he understood, but he didn't cry. He never cries. He draws. There was no signature, but it didn't need one. This was Laura Palmer's voice, understated, meticulous, and tinged with the faintest brush of defiance. Love, reading over his shoulder, said it's like she was writing to someone who'd read it later, not just recording it for herself. She was, said Purbright. She wrote it for the boy. That afternoon, they visited the last address listed for Laura Palmer, a flat above a former tailor's shop on Welby Street, now boarded up and offering excellent development potential according to a sign that had faded past optimism. The landlord, a man of trousers and complaints, met them with a sour look and a mouth that moved as if chewing unspoken grievances. She left years ago, he said. Didn't even break the lease. Just posted the keys through the letterbox with a note. Thank you for the roof. I've given it back. Did she ever have visitors? Purbright asked. Only one regular, a young lad. Never spoke, never made a mess either. Never knew his name. Would sit by the window for hours, just looking out. They thanked him, though there was little to thank. The room upstairs was empty save for dust and a faded mark on the wallpaper where a chair had once rested. As they descended the narrow staircase, Love asked, "What are we missing?" Purbright paused halfway down. "We're not missing anything. We're being asked not to look further." That night, another drawing arrived. No envelope this time, just slipped under the station door. It showed the bench at Ribblecombe Halt again, but empty. The tree in the background had shed all its leaves, and where the boy had once stood was only the outline of a coat, sketched faintly in grey. On the back, one line in the same careful handwriting. He doesn't need to be watched now. Love looked at it in silence. That's it then. It's what she wanted, Purbright said. The boy was never the mystery. The mystery was whether we'd notice, whether we'd allow something to pass through Flaxborough without folding it into rumour or law. Love glanced at the drawing again, brow creased. So, she leaves him visible just long enough to be remembered, then lets him go. Vanishes. Leaves breadcrumbs. And when she's sure someone followed them, Purbright finished, she stops. The case, as far as the chief constable was concerned, closed quietly, if indeed it had ever officially opened. There was no paperwork to file, only a polite acknowledgement that no further disturbances are anticipated. The flower show resumed its usual post-mortem debates about jam viscosity, and the cemetery path was relayed, though the trench behind the greenhouse remained untouched, as if the groundskeepers had agreed, silently, to let the earth hold its secret. Miss Teatime dropped in one last time, bearing a tin of sponge fingers and a self-satisfied expression. "I dreamt of silence last night," she announced. "Not the absence of sound, but the kind of silence that follows a proper ending." Purbright, sipping tea, said, "Then I hope you slept well." She inclined her head. "As always, Inspector. When mysteries resolve, the dead rest better. And so do I." In the weeks that followed, Flaxborough's attention turned to other matters. A councillor's misplaced spectacles, the retiling of the Methodist roof, and a pig that had taken to napping in the post office doorway. But for Purbright, the image of the boy in the coat remained. not as a case, but as a story someone had trusted him to understand. He returned to the cemetery once more, on a grey afternoon when the rain was too lazy to fall and merely hung in the air like breath. He stood before Edgar Mason's grave, hands behind his back, and said nothing. Then, very gently, he placed the child's drawing, the last one, inside the biscuit tin and set it beneath the yew tree. No plaque, no ribbon, just a small moment returned to the soil. As he turned to go, he saw someone watching from the far path. A woman, hatless, quiet. She did not wave. She did not smile. She simply nodded once, a gesture of thanks or perhaps of farewell, and disappeared among the trees. Purbright did not follow. There was nothing more to be done, and besides, some endings are only complete when left alone. A week passed. Rain came and went in small, half-hearted bursts, like apologies from a neighbor who didn't mean to offend. The streets of Flaxborough resumed their habitual rhythms, Rotary Club minutes, council hedge trimming disputes, and an ongoing argument between the vicar and the bakery over whether saffron buns constituted liturgical excess. To the casual observer, nothing lingered of the strange boy, the vanished woman, or the unspoken story planted beneath a cemetery yew. But in the quiet corners, the post office queue, the tea-cake aisle at Todman's grocer's, and the low pews of St. Etheldreda's, the tale found its shape. Not exactly in facts, but in something more durable. Suggestion. A few said the boy had been a ghost. Others said he'd been brought by a cousin from out of town, or a secret heir to some minor estate. A theory involving a medium and a time capsule gained popularity among the bridge club. Purbright, who did not believe in ghosts or bridge club logic, found himself oddly unbothered by the distortion. Stories, like topsoil, were meant to shift a little. Sergeant Love, however, remained unsettled. He had taken to rereading the diary left behind by Laura Palmer, not for procedural clues, but as if seeking something more human. Most days he kept it in his drawer, alongside a spare badge and a once-bitten pencil, and would thumb through it when paperwork grew too dry or the station clock ticked a little too loudly. One afternoon, he knocked on Purbright's office door without waiting to be asked. "She writes," he said, holding the diary open, "about someone named M. Not often, just 3 times, always just the initial. I thought it might have been Mason, but she calls him Edgar everywhere else, even in private." Purbright looked up from his blotter. "What does she say?" Love read aloud. "June 2nd, M came to the garden again. He's brought the boy a book on insects. I wish he'd ask instead of just appearing." He turned the page. "July 29th, M is angry. Not about the boy, about me. He says silence is crueler than truth. I asked him if he thought exposure kinder." Then, the final entry. "September 5th. M told me he's leaving. Says the town is too small for things that don't explain themselves. He left the boy a drawing pencil. I didn't say goodbye." Purbright leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. "M then," he said softly. "Someone else in the triangle. Not the father, not the boy. The observer. Or the judge," Love added. "Someone who disagreed with her methods." "Have we ever had anyone resign around then?" Purbright asked. "Late 1964. A teacher, perhaps. A counselor. Someone who might have known about the boy but not been in a position to stop anything. Only witness it." Love frowned. "I'll ask Marjorie in records. She likes a rummage." They left it at that, but the question stuck like a burr. That night, Purbright walked the long way home. His route took him along the edge of the cemetery, a habit he'd picked up not from morbidity, but for the quiet. The roads around it rarely saw traffic, and the hedgerows seemed to keep their own counsel. As he passed the western gate, he saw something strange. The yew tree, Edgar Mason's yew, had been trimmed. Not by the council. That much was clear. Council trimmings were methodical and resented. This was precise, sympathetic. One branch had been lifted just enough to let in light. Beneath it, someone had placed a smooth white stone, unmarked, polished by hand. No name, no message, but placed with care. Purbright stood in silence for a moment, then glanced behind him. The path was empty. No one watching. He did not touch the stone. Instead, the following day, he visited Miss Teatime. Not for spiritual guidance, though he had come to believe her dreams were perhaps only a little more theatrical than most people's instincts, but for something else. She was in her conservatory, feeding seed cake to a parrot that neither spoke nor flew. "Inspector," she said brightly, "I was wondering when you'd arrive." The marzipans just cooled. "I came to ask about M." Her expression changed. Not surprise. Something closer to restraint. "I don't dabble in initials," she said. "They're harder to divine." "You mentioned once," he continued, "that you used to see a man visiting Laura Palmer, not at the cemetery, in town. You never mentioned a name." Miss Teatime smiled faintly. "And I'm not going to now." Purbright tilted his head. "Because you can't, or because you promised not to?" She took a long sip of tea before replying. "Inspector, some people don't leave towns. They only fold into the edges of them. M was one of those. A watcher, a writer of sorts. He saw what Laura was doing and didn't agree, but he didn't stop her either." "He left?" He changed names. Roles. I imagine he still walks past the post office once a week, nodding at Mrs. Clitheroe, tipping his hat to the past." "You're saying he's still here?" "I'm saying," she said carefully, "that Flaxborough contains more than one way to be forgotten." Purbright nodded once. That was all she would give. That afternoon, the final thread arrived. Not through deduction or confession, but through a small exhibition in the Flaxborough Library's rear hall, hosted by the Ladies' Historical Society. It was titled Unseen Flaxborough, Children's Drawings, 1950 to 1970. Love had gone only to appease his landlady, who insisted her nephew had once drawn a fine sketch of a cheese wheel and deserved public acclaim. But there, in the center panel, among scrawls of playgrounds, sheep, and wartime tanks, was a simple pencil drawing of a tree and a bench. In the corner, a name written in a tidy, cautious script. Gareth L. Palmer. The date, September 1964. Love stood staring at it for a long moment before fetching Purbright. Together, they stood in front of the panel. "You think this is the last thing he left behind before she hid him again?" Love asked. "I think," Purbright said. It was the first thing he was allowed to say. He stepped closer, for there, beneath the pencil lines, nearly erased by time and pressure, was the faint trace of another mark, an initial. Purbright said nothing. That night he walked to the cemetery once more. The stone beneath the yew was still there. Next to it, someone had placed a pencil, clean, unsharpened, waiting. Purbright did not disturb it. Instead, he stood for a while in the soft dusk, until the lamplight behind him grew long and the trees overhead began to whisper things even the town didn't want repeated. Then, quietly, he turned and walked home. The days shortened. Morning arrived later and with less enthusiasm, and even the geese flying overhead seemed to do so with a resigned honk. Flaxborough wore its autumn like a second skin, damp at the edges, tinged with fading color, but still stitched together by habit. Inside the police station, the atmosphere had settled into its usual rhythm. Domestic disputes over budgie noise, a suspicious turnip reported outside the co-op, which turned out to be a stone in a paper bag, and one particularly dramatic claim from Mrs. Routledge that the council's new pavement slabs were tilted toward damnation. But beneath the surface, under tea breaks and form filling, the remnants of the boy's story lingered. Purbright kept the diary in his desk now, unopened. Not for lack of curiosity, but out of a kind of respect. Some truths, once glimpsed, did not require rereading. They merely needed not to be forgotten. One late afternoon, with the shadows in his office growing long and his pen leaking onto the blotter, he received a visitor, unexpected and yet not unfamiliar. Mr. Merivale, retired headmaster, once a figure of high collars and low tolerance for gum chewing, now a man in a weathered mackintosh with a tendency to look over his shoulder even indoors. He walked with a limp that had arrived some time after his pension and wore the expression of someone perpetually preparing to speak but deciding against it. Purbright offered him a chair and waited. "I hear," said Merivale after a long silence, "that you've been looking into the Palmer business." Purbright inclined his head. "Not officially. Still, it's stirred dust." "It has." Merivale pulled something from his pocket. A postcard, faded, dog-eared. He placed it on the desk like a piece of evidence. It showed a train, hand-drawn, childlike but detailed. The rails were exact, the smoke billowed in careful arcs, and in the corner, in small block letters, "Gareth." "I kept this," said Merivale, "for no reason other than I didn't know what else to do with it." Purbright waited. "I was the M in her diary," Merivale said flatly, "though I doubt that surprises you." "No. I met her through the council's reading group. She came to discuss the proposed beautification of Flaxborough initiative, a ridiculous thing involving bunting and begonias. But she didn't care about flowers. She cared about graves, about what people did and didn't remember." Purbright folded his hands. "She told me about the boy," Merivale continued. "Not directly, never directly, but she hinted, spoke of inheritance without names, of silence as a form of protection. I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing." "You disagreed with her," Purbright said. "Violently, but politely. I thought hiding him was cruelty dressed as care. She thought exposure was a slow kind of violence." He exhaled. "She wasn't wrong, but nor was I. What happened to him?" "I don't know, truly." Merivale looked down at the postcard. "She said he'd leave when he understood. Not before. Said the town had to see him but not interfere. Just see. And now, I think he's gone." Purbright studied the card for a long moment. "Why now, do you think? After all these years?" Merivale's voice softened. "Because she's dying." The words hung between them, simple and cold. "She sent me the diary," he said. "Asked me to deliver it if she couldn't. Said it was time for Gareth's story to be seen by someone who understood patience." Purbright nodded. "Thank you for bringing it." "I suppose," Merivale said, rising slowly, "some things can't be prosecuted. Only noticed. Or mourned. Perhaps." He left without ceremony, and Purbright did not move for a while. The card remained on the desk, smoke from the little pencil train coiling upward into nothing. That evening, Love returned from the newsagent with the Flaxborough Herald tucked under his arm and 2 crumbling Eccles cakes in a paper bag. "There's a notice," he said, flattening the paper on Purbright's desk. "Back page." It was small, unassuming. "In memory of L.P., a life kept quiet." Nothing more to say. There was no date of death, no location, no relatives mentioned, just a signature at the bottom, a printed G in fine italic script. Love folded the paper again and said nothing. A few days later, Purbright walked once more to the cemetery, this time alone, without notebook or purpose. He did not pass the graveyard as a detective, but as a man who had been entrusted with something quiet. The yew stood as ever, green despite the season, The pencil was gone now. In its place, a small paper boat, neatly folded, had been laid at the base of the tree. There were no markings on it, but as Purbright looked closer, he saw that the paper was a page torn from the diary, one of the blank ones near the end. It had been filled now, in a child's hand, or perhaps someone mimicking it. The page read, "Thank you for not asking too many questions. That's what makes it a kind town." Purbright crouched beside the tree, his knees complaining faintly. He placed the postcard there, too, just under the roots, where the soil had settled once more into forgetfulness. He stood and looked around the cemetery one last time. Nothing stirred, but somewhere, not far, not near, but somehow always within reach, the sense of someone watching lingered. Not with fear, but with gratitude. That night, as he finished a modest supper and let the radio play a piece of Brahms into the wallpaper, Purbright reached for the diary one last time. He opened it to the final page. There, in his own neat handwriting, he wrote, "Case closed, but never forgotten." Then, gently, he shut it and did not open it again. It was late October now, and Flaxborough's evenings came with an early hush, the kind that encouraged second cups of tea and made even the rowdiest dogs fall quiet by 6:30. The town, always more inclined toward suggestion than statement, had begun to fold the strange matter of the boy and the woman into something approximating folklore. You heard it mentioned, vaguely, politely, in butcher shop queues, or as the final note in a bridge club anecdote. Of course, it was about then that the child appeared. You remember the one? With the coat and the cabbage? But even as the story blurred, something in its center had solidified. As if, by choosing not to prod too much, the town had allowed it to take root. At the station, Purbright found himself in a rare moment of pause. No one had telephoned about the cemetery in over a week. No more drawings had arrived. The pencil and the paper boat had both vanished, perhaps into the hands of the wind, perhaps into the pocket of someone who still felt they were part of the story. He looked over at the diary, which now lived in a brown envelope marked simply "to be returned, if asked." The chief constable, when briefed on the matter, lightly and with the kind of verbal footnotes Purbright had perfected over the years, had nodded with the air of a man grateful that something peculiar had resolved itself without budget or headlines. He made one comment. Unusual family business, then. But tidy, you've a gift for these tidier ones, Purbright. To which Purbright had merely replied, "Yes, sir," and said no more. Sergeant Love had resumed his usual beat of minor crimes and misdirected parcels. But the boy's story remained lodged somewhere behind his eyes, visible whenever he caught sight of a child alone on a bench or a shoe left too carefully by a door. One morning, as the fog hung low over Market Street, Love appeared in the office with a letter. Hand-delivered, no envelope, just folded once and placed under the station's front mat. He handed it over wordlessly. Purbright opened it. There were only 7 words written in that same careful, unhurried hand. "Please stop looking." It was always enough. Purbright read it twice. Then again. He folded it neatly and placed it with the diary. Later that day, he walked through the high street alone, nodding occasionally to shopkeepers, stepping around a man installing Christmas lights. Too early. The town hummed with quiet anticipation. Not of anything grand, but of winter coats and roast chicken and the kind of everyday peace that had to be earned over time. He passed the library, where the children's drawings had now been taken down and replaced with posters advertising local history lectures and fire safety talks. But on the corkboard near the entrance, half tucked behind a flyer for a pantomime audition, was something familiar. A new drawing. Simple. Pencil. A figure in a long coat, seated beneath a tree, his hands folded. It was unmistakably Purbright, and beneath the tree, instead of a gravestone or a bench, was a small row of boxes. square, neat and closed. There was no signature, but in the corner, faintly, the edge of a green ribbon had been drawn. Not attached to anything, just resting there. He left it on the board. When he returned to the station, Love had found something else. "From the county records," he said, handing over a yellowing file. "Not official police business, but I thought you might want to see it." It was a birth certificate. Gareth Lionel Palmer. Born 9th January, 1959. Mother, unknown. Father, not recorded, registered by Laura Palmer. Middle name, Love said, was Lionel. Same as Edgar Mason's grandfather. It's not proof, but it's a thread. Purbright nodded. She honored him in name. Quietly. "Do you think she lied on the certificate?" "No," said Purbright. "I think she protected the truth by leaving it unfinished." That night he sat at his desk long after the lamps had been switched off in the rest of the station. The sound of the clock was steady, not loud, but unignorable, and the occasional groan of pipes from the walls reminded him that the building was older than most of the cases it held. He opened the diary one last time, not to read, but to place something inside. A copy of the photograph, the one from the Ribblecombe Holt. Gareth standing beside the bench, coat too big, eyes slightly downcast, as if he were already preparing to be remembered instead of known. Purbright slipped the photo between the final pages and closed the diary gently. Then he took the envelope marked "To be returned if asked" and wrote a new note across the front. Let it rest. He placed it in the drawer and turned the key. The following morning, a small envelope was waiting for him on his desk. It contained no message, only a tiny folded drawing, a hand reaching down toward a smaller hand, not grasping, not holding, just offering. Beneath it, in letters too small to have been meant for notice, he's drawing now. Purbright sat very still. Then he folded the paper and placed it beside the others. The next day, he and Love went to the cemetery one last time. Not to investigate, not to disturb. They brought a small potted plant, a yew sapling, and planted it behind the tree. No label, no ceremony. Just a quiet promise that some things should grow slowly. As they turned to leave, Love paused. "Do you think," he said, "that one day someone else will ask about this? Years from now, another inspector maybe, another strange box?" Purbright looked up at the tree. "If they do," he said, "I hope they ask kindly. That's all the story ever needed." And with that, they walked back into the town, where the shops were opening, the buses were hissing into their stops, and life, that soft, stubborn thing, went on. Unremarkable. And enough. It was a Thursday when the last note came, folded into a page of the Flaxborough Mercury, the gardening supplement no less, and delivered not to the station, but to Purbright's own letterbox at home, which had not received anonymous post in several years. The handwriting was the same, steady, sparse. The paper smelt faintly of lavender. It read, "There are no more drawings. The rest are his to make alone." There was no signature, no address, just that. And it was, somehow, final. Purbright stood at the window for a while, the note resting on his desk, untouched beside a lukewarm cup of tea. The morning outside was all soft grays and movement, leaves rustling across paving stones, a cyclist wobbling past with 2 loaves of bread under one arm, a woman in a raincoat shaking her keys before unlocking a gate as if they might apologize for her lateness. He watched these things quietly, then returned to the desk. He did not file the note. He did not reply. He simply folded it and placed it inside the back cover of the diary, which had remained unopened now for several days. Then he stood, took his coat from its peg, and made his way into the town. He walked, not with purpose, but with intention. The kind of walk that makes room for interruption and invites coincidence. Outside the post office, he paused. Miss Teatime was seated on a bench beside a small thermos and a bag of suspiciously pink wafers. "I had a feeling you might pass this way," she said, without looking up. Purbright gave her a courteous nod. "Good morning." "Is it?" "I hadn't quite decided. The clouds seem unsure. I've had a letter." She patted the bench beside her. He sat. "Does it end it then?" she asked, sipping from a small metal cup. "It does," she nodded. "Good. I thought," he said after a pause, "that endings might feel more resolved." Miss Teatime smiled. "Only in novels. In life, they tend to feel like a cupboard closed with something still rattling inside. Do you believe he'll be all right?" "The boy?" Purbright nodded. Miss Teatime considered. "He's drawing. That's something. You can't draw if you've stopped looking." They sat in silence for a while, watching the town continue as if it hadn't carried, just weeks ago, a story too strange and too quiet for headlines. At the grocer's, Mrs. Clitheroe was arguing over the price of marrows. A man with a hearing aid was attempting to return a tin of beans he had apparently purchased by accident. A child, face smeared with biscuit, sat in a pram pointing at birds as if naming them for the first time. Everything was ordinary. Everything was exactly as it had been before. And yet. Later that afternoon, Purbright walked once more to the yew. Not as an investigator, nor as a witness, just as someone who remembered. The earth beneath the tree had settled. The plant he and Love had planted weeks ago had taken to the soil, small but steady. He placed one gloved hand to the bark of the yew. Not reverently, just briefly. Then he turned away. As he reached the cemetery gates, he noticed something new. A small metal plaque, newly fixed to the outer wall. Not brass, something subtler, perhaps steel. The lettering was engraved, not embossed. Carefully done. It read, "For the ones who kept the quiet." No name, no attribution, no date. Just that. He said nothing. A week later, Love stopped him outside the station. "We've had a call, a woman in Netherwick," he said. "She found a tin box buried in her garden." Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Another one?" he asked. Love shrugged. "She says it had a drawing inside, a bench, a tree, but not the yew. Just an ordinary one. She didn't think it meant anything until she saw the article in the Mercury about the cemetery work." There was an article. Council's new budget included the word arboricultural. The editor got overexcited. Purbright allowed himself a small smile. "Did she leave a name?" Love nodded. "She said it wasn't hers, that it belonged to a neighbor's grandson. Moved in 6 months ago, never said much, but he drew, constantly. Always trees." Purbright said nothing for a moment. Then, "Let it be. If they ask, we'll say the box was left during the war, for safekeeping." Love nodded. "Understood." By the time winter settled, Flaxborough had returned fully to its rhythm. The Flower Show committee was already arguing over spring categories. A local man had found a hedgehog in his garage and attempted to report it as an intruder. And Miss Teatime had taken up origami, which she claimed was an excellent medium for channeling warnings. As for Purbright, he filed no report. No charges, no formal summary. He simply kept the diary, the photograph, and the final note inside a small box in his desk. Once a week, he would open it, just to make sure the papers hadn't vanished, and then close it again. No one asked, but perhaps someone, years later, might. And if they did, he would tell them there was a boy, and a woman who kept him safe, and a town that chose not to interfere. He would say nothing else. Because, as Laura Palmer had once written, some things become sacred not because of their grandeur, but because enough people chose not to say more than necessary. And that, in the end, had been the quiet miracle of it all. The End.